But wait, then you guys say, okay, well, that was too boring, so let's not do a graph because a lot of you guys hate graphing. Well, okay, let's try to do it with a sign chart instead, because sign charts tell me my y values, whether or not they're positive or negative. So positive, which just means above the x-axis. Negative is just going to mean that my graph would be below the y-axis at the time. So sign charts are basically your x-axis, and all that we're going to put on this x-axis are critical points. Well, where did these critical numbers or critical points come from? Well, it's going to come from these factors that we got right here. And just like in Algebra 1, I'm going to take each one of those factors, and I'm going to set each one of those equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve for x. So I know x is going to equal 1, x is going to equal 7, and x is going to equal negative 5 over 3. And those values are going to go on this little number line. Fun. So I've got negative 5 over 3, I've got 1, I've got 7. Alright, well that's cool, so I know that these points are important, but how do I know what's going on in between them? Well, pick a number, any number, that's on this side of my number line. So pick a number that comes before 5/3. For example, negative 2. So negative 2, I'm going to go in, I'm going to plug into each one of these factors, and for x, so if I plug in negative 2 instead of x, I would get overall a negative number. Well, negative squared is going to be a positive. And then I've got a negative in here for x. That's going to be negative. And then I plug in a negative 2 there, and it's going to give me a negative. So then I just see overall, I'm going to have a positive times a negative, which overall, that whole piece is going to be positive, meaning all of my y values on that side of that critical value are going to be above my x-axis. Okay, my next piece, I'm going to plug in something in between negative 5/3 and 1 into each one of my factors. So for example, I'm going to pick 0 because I love to plug in 0. So I'd get a negative squared, which is going to give me a positive number. I'm going to get 0 minus 7, which will get me a negative number overall. And then 0 times 3 plus 5 will overall get me a positive number. So a positive times a negative will give me a negative overall. My next piece, I'm going to plug in numbers in between 1 and 7. So for example, 2. So if I plug in 2 into here, that'll get me a positive. And then if I plug in 2 there, I'm going to get a negative. And then if I plug in 2 here, I'm going to get a positive. Which means that overall, this piece is also going to be negative. And then finally, last but not least, I'm going to plug in something over here after 7. So for example, 8. So 8 minus 1 is going to give me positive. Square that, still going to be positive. Alright, and then I'm going to get positive in here. And then I plug in 8 in for x here, and I still get a positive. So overall, this whole piece is positive. So what this graph would look like, I know it doesn't say to graph it. But basically, I would have something like, whee, it's going to cross from being positive to negative. Okay, it's going to come back up probably, touch at this 1 to make that a critical value, or a 0, or an x-intercept. And then it would cross there as well. And that's what my graph would look like. But I'm basically graphing without drawing a proper graph. Cool. So now we got to show the inequality where it is greater than 0. Well, it's greater than 0 on the intervals where it is going to be positive. If I'm just looking at a sign chart, which would be those two intervals sitting right there on my x-axis. So that would be from negative infinity to negative 5/3. And union with 7 to positive infinity. Cannot include that 7, cannot include that 5/3, because it is only greater than 0. It is not or equal to. Alright, let's go to the next example.